will be the last one of 2022, a year of turbulence and high uncertainty caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine 9 months ago. Since then, the economic outlook for the euro area and the global economy has deteriorated dramatically. At the beginning of 2022, it was only a remote possibility that we would be simultaneously facing such serious risk of high inflation, recession, and financial instability. But as the war continues, this is now, unfortunately, becoming a baseline scenario. In this context, two topics were chosen by the Econ Committee coordinators for today's meeting. The first one is inflation as a global challenge, and the second one is inflation differentials, consequences for monetary policy. As usual, all briefing papers that were prepared by the European Parliament's panel of experts are available on the Econ Committee's website, and some of them were presented and discussed last Thursday in Strasbourg. Our experts highlighted that both international coordination and domestic coordination between monetary policy and fiscal policy would be extremely important. As for international coordination, our experts' view seems to be confirmed by the most recent OECD economic outlook that was published last week. OECD finds that when all central banks hike interest rates simultaneously, the negative impact on GDP is larger, but the impact on inflation is smaller because the foreign exchange channel is muted. Coordination would therefore be essential, but we all know that it is historically extremely difficult to get. As for internal coordination, all our experts agreed that domestic monetary and fiscal coordination would be probably the first and most important step to be considered. While everybody agreed that monetary policy has to intervene, it is important that fiscal policy plays a role too. By its nature, fiscal policy can be more targeted than monetary policy and therefore may help households and firms to face extra large energy bills and can reduce possible second-round effects on wages, making central banks' task easier. Monetary and fiscal policy can be synergic in the sense that if you use both, you can use less of each if taken alone. Of course, the domestic coordination of monetary and fiscal policy is not easy too. However, an uncoordinated solution may have strong negative impact on real economy as well on financial stability. What is important is that we should not be too demanding on what monetary policy can do in this context. If we give the idea that central banks can do whatever they want with inflation, we might risk to endanger their credibility and therefore their own effectiveness. We should not ask them too much, but we have to ask them what is right. And we have all to coordinate all the policy efforts on monetary, fiscal, economic side, because that's the only way we can really get out of the current dramatic situation. So today's meeting is organized as follows. There will be introductory remarks by President Christine Lagarde of 10 minutes, followed by a first round of questions, one slot per political group, where each speaker will have 1.5 minutes for the initial question and 3 minutes for the answer, with the possibility of a follow-up question of 1 minute maximum for the question and 2 minutes maximum for the answer. And then we will have a second round of questions where we will apply the DONT system with 1 minute for the question and 3 minutes for the answer. So please stick to the time, one question at a time. This will make the debate easier, smoother, and we will have the opportunity to ask all the questions and have all the answers. Okay, President Lagarde, we are now looking forward to hearing you. You have 10 minutes.
I'm confused. Thank you very much. Madam Chair, honourable members of the Economic and Monetary Affairs Committee, ladies and gentlemen, over the past 12 months, the ECB has embarked on a swift and comprehensive process of normalising monetary policy. First, we ended net asset purchases in a matter of a few months. You know what? I'm going to move that a little bit. No? Okay.
Maybe it's this one.
Is it better? Okay. So first, we ended net asset purchases in a matter of a few months. Next, we started raising our policy rates at their fastest pace ever. In my short remarks today, I will briefly look back on the past year, as this is our last meeting before year-end, and I will focus on the key actions taken by the ECB and the EU more broadly to address people's concerns. I will also address briefly the two topics selected by this committee for today's hearing, namely the global monetary policy cycle and inflation differentials, or the divergence. So as the Chair indicated, it has been a challenging year for the Europeans. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has caused widespread human suffering. It has also shattered our sense of safety, threatened our energy security, disrupted supply chains, and contributed to pushing inflation well above our targets. The shock hit just as we were coming out of the pandemic and has continued to cause economic disruptions. The repercussions have been felt not only in Europe, but also around the world. Inflation has surged almost everywhere, prompting central banks, pretty much all of them except two, to raise interest rates and leading financing conditions to tighten rapidly worldwide. And this is something that you will have observed in the 2 pages that I'm sure you all received, and it's at the bottom of page 2. This is also the topic that you have chosen. Now, given our proximity to the conflict and our dependence on energy imports, Europe in particular has been hit especially hard. Higher energy costs have been a key driver of euro area inflation, which in October reached double digits for the first time since the start of monetary union, with a reading of 10.6. While the energy shock and global bottlenecks have constrained supply, the reopening of the economy after the pandemic has led to a rapid release of pent-up demand, contributing to the upward pressure from demand factors on core inflation, which has increased gradually over the year. And that is referenced in the first page of the document that you have received in the middle panel. The rise in inflation affects everyone, but some are feeling it more than others. And I'm thinking particularly of those on low income, who spend a larger share of their consumption budgets on essentials such as food, electricity, gas and heating expenses, while having lower financial buffers to cover the rising cost of living. Currently, the gap between the effective inflation rate experienced by the lowest and the highest income group is by far at its highest level on record in the euro area. And we at the ECB have conducted research on that particular matter to evaluate by how much it is harder on the lower income quintile. The divergence in inflation rates across euro area member countries is also at a record high, mainly due to different degrees of exposure to the energy shock and to the pandemic. And this is also in your 2-pager on the second page in the upper panel, and this is a topic that is widely discussed by the papers that you have commissioned in respect of divergence within the euro area. We are monitoring those differences carefully and expect them to normalise as the impact of these shocks fades over time. The different shocks over the past year have also had an impact on real economic activity. And while the reopening of the economy after the pandemic resulted in surprisingly strong activity at the beginning of the year, growth is now slowing down rapidly as a consequence of the war. By reducing people's real income and pushing up costs for firms, high inflation is dampening spending and production. High uncertainty, tighter financial conditions, and weakening global demand are also weighing on economic growth, which is expected to continue weakening for the remainder of this year, fourth quarter, and the beginning of next year, first quarter of 23. And that's referenced in your two-pager as well. So how can the ECB address people's concern that I have referred to now, while also delivering on its mandate, which is price stability? Faced with the unprecedented challenges that you know well and that I have briefly alluded to, Europe has risen to the occasion and shown a strong sense of unity and solidarity, thanks also to the crucial role played by this Parliament in pushing for genuinely European actions. Beyond providing financial, humanitarian and military assistance to Ukraine, the European Union has taken significant steps to shield us from the consequences of the war, enhance our resilience and reduce our energy dependence. The European response to the war has garnered broad support amongst citizens, and optimism about the future of the EU has increased. 2 out of 3 citizens now consider their country's EU membership as a good thing, and this is the highest result since 2007. I know we tend to like to beat our chest, but now and again it's also helpful to see how your action, our action collectively are perceived. But the same surveys also show that 1/3 of citizens find the rising cost of living to be the most important issue facing the European Union. And although the majority of citizens believe that the defence of our common European values must be a priority, even if this has a negative impact on the cost of living, every policymaker should respond to this challenge. So in accordance with its mandate of price stability, the ECB is doing its part. Our third major policy rate increase in October, resulting in a cumulative increase of 200 basis points since July, underscores our commitment to tame inflation. It is the fastest paced ever since the creation of the euro. This increase was accompanied by a recalibration for our targeted longer-term refinancing operations, often referred to as TLTRO III, to reinforce the transmission of our policy rate increases to bank lending conditions and contribute by so doing to the normalization of the Eurosystem balance sheet. In December, at our next Monetary Policy Governing Council meeting, we will also lay out the key principles for reducing the bond holdings in our asset purchase programme portfolio, because it is appropriate that this balance sheet be normalised over time in a measured and predictable way. Interest rates are and remain and will remain the key tool for fighting inflation. Higher interest rates reduce demand pressures by making it more expensive to borrow money and by influencing how much people and businesses spend, save, borrow and invest. And this in turn puts downward pressure on prices, although the adjustment will take some time to be felt in the economy. Higher interest rates will also have an immediate effect on people's and business expectations about future inflation, thereby guarding against the risk of second-round effects. Persistently high inflation could lead to de-anchored inflation expectations, which then become ingrained in wage negotiations and price settings. Not only would the resultant wage price spirals prove self-defeating in supporting real income economy-wide, but it would also hamper the productive capacity of the economy as a whole. Strong labour markets, with the unemployment rate still at the historically low level of 6.6% in September, are likely to support higher wages. Incoming data suggests that wages are picking up and we will continue to assess their implications for the medium-term inflation outlook, and that is referenced to in the first page of the document that we have sent you. So while monetary policy is geared towards bringing inflation back to our medium-term target, the economic outlook will also depend on the action taken by other stakeholders. In the current environment of high inflation, fiscal policy needs to be considerate not add to inflationary pressures. Fiscal support should therefore be targeted, temporary and tailored. It should be targeted so that the size of the fiscal impulse is limited and benefits those who need it most. It must be tailored so that it does not weaken incentives to cut energy demand, and temporary so that the fiscal impulse is not maintained longer than strictly necessary. At the same time, government should pursue fiscal policies that show they are committed to gradually bringing down their public debt ratio. Delivering on the ECB mandates will create the conditions for strong and sustainable growth that will benefit everyone. Yet, achieving price stability is a necessary but not sufficient conditions, as other policy areas need to act. Removing constraints on economic growth through an ambitious economic reform agenda at the EU and national levels will not only rebuild supply that has been impaired by the recent shocks, it will also over time strengthen the resilience of our economy in a world that is becoming less predictable. In this respect, we welcome the Commission's proposal to reform the EU economic governance framework. Sustainable fiscal policies are needed to not only ensure medium-term debt sustainability, but also to support the three key transitions that will determine our future and our growth model towards cleaner energy, greater economic security, a more digital and productive economy. The Commission proposals are a good starting point for discussions, and I encourage EU policymakers, including the Parliament, to soon reach a viable and broadly shared agreement to help strengthen the foundation of our economic and monetary union. So in conclusion, we are committed to bringing inflation down to our medium-term target, and we are determined to take all the necessary measures to that effect. We expect to raise rates further to the levels needed to ensure that inflation returns to our 2% medium-term target in a timely manner. In this environment of high uncertainty and with complex shocks hitting the economy, the Governing Council decisions will continue to be data-dependent and follow a meeting-by-meeting approach. How much further we need to go, how fast we need to get there, will be based on our updated outlook, on the persistence of the shocks, on the reaction of wages and inflation expectations, and on our assessment of the transmission of policy stance. I now stand ready to take your questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And now we start our first round of questions, and we start with Esther De Lange for EPP. Esther, you have 1 minute and a half.
Yes, thank you very much, Madam Chair and Madam President. Thank you very much for being with us today. I would be tempted to directly ask, how fast then? Referring to your latest statements, but I'm quite sure you're going to stick with the brief that you have. So allow me maybe to touch upon an issue that is not directly linked to monetary policy, but that has strong financial stability considerations, and that's the energy derivatives market. I mean, energy is in all of our minds, and you have spoken about the inflation really touching the lowest income groups most, and therefore I think in this Parliament there are many who want to do something and who have already done quite a lot. Now, and you've also mentioned the fact that these measures need to be more targeted than they are in most member states. But I would like to talk about the proposal by the Commission to cap them on the head TTF gas contract derivatives in case certain conditions are met, the latest proposal of the Commission. Now, you will be aware that the Financial Times has also reported that the leading exchange platform for these contracts estimates that merely introducing this cap, so without triggering it, would lead to increased margin calls for energy traders of around 33 billion. That is at least what the Financial Times told us. And this comes, of course, on top of the fact that many energy firms are already liquidity strained, such as Uniper, and that according to the ECB itself, margin requirements for energy producers have already doubled in this year. So my question is, does the ECB share this assessment that we've all read in the Financial Times, that introducing the price cap would lead to significant increases in collateral requirements? And what is then the ECB's opinion of this instrument, given the effects it could have on energy markets, CCPs, bank credit lines, and in the end, financial stability as a whole?
Yes, if I may, we will have a hearing exactly on this topic on Thursday. So
but
I hope we will have
really
the same
interested
attendance.
in what the President has to say on the issue, because it's something that is really close to our hearts at the moment.
Well, thank you very much, Madame Delange, for this question. It is close to your heart. It is close to our heart as well, because it is clearly one of the key components of inflation. When we look at, by how much energy has contributed to inflation, by how much month over month, it has affected all citizens and clearly impacted the inflation, it is important. 41% is nothing that we should be treating casually. So we are very attentive to the work that is being done. We are very keen to see a European response, because as I tried to say in my introductory remarks, whenever Europe reacts as a whole and not on a piecemeal basis, country by country, it is stronger, and it is demonstrating the value that it can deliver for the citizens. I'm not going to give you much by way of our opinion concerning the proposed I'm assuming that you're referring to the cap mechanism that has been put in place, and that obviously has been caused by the various margin calls and the derivative market disruption that we saw much earlier. I'm not going to give you an opinion for the simple reason that we've been alerted to it only a few days ago, and that the ECB is mentioned on a couple of occasions, actually more than a couple of occasions, in that document, and as a result of which we will give a seasoned and thought-through opinion on this matter to see what role we can play, how we can help, and in which respect, from a financial stability point of view and purely financial stability point of view, we can offer some assistance. But we do not actually take a view on the efficiency of the tool, because it is not something for us to opine upon. We will look at it from a financial stability viewpoint, and we will look at the instances where the ECB would be called upon to providing its views. But we certainly cannot be acting as a substitute for political decisions that need to be made and that are called for at the political level, not at the level of the European Central Bank.
Thank you very much. You want to use your 1 minute for the follow-up?
Yes, if I may. One question is already answered. That was whether the ECB would publish an analysis of the proposal, which I think is good. Secondly, would the ECB be interested in having the formal task of giving its opinion before such a cap is triggered, so that the ECB were to be asked if triggering was coming into view, that you would have to give an opinion on the financial stability implications of that. And if you don't want to answer that question, you can always comment on Governing Council Board member Isabel Schnabel's comments last week about the incoming data so far, suggesting that the room for slowing down the pace of interest rates adjustment remains limited. Of course, you're not going to give us much more than your final paragraph, but maybe you can say a couple of words on her statement and where you expect that analysis to go in the next months ahead.
So this is not really a follow-up question. It's another question that you're asking, which is a completely different story.
The first one was a follow-up, whether the ECB would want a formal role in the triggering of the instrument.
I think I tried to make it clear in my initial answer, which is that, if asked about financial stability, my suspicion And this is a bit premature because we have not conducted the analysis. And while our international department has worked really hard over the weekend to make sure that they understood the ramifications, the various points in the decision-making process where the ECB would be consulted, we would give an opinion, a legal opinion, if you will, on the document on these various aspects, not on the entire instrument that is being proposed, but on the areas where the ECB would be consulted for financial stability purposes. As I understand, prior, upon operating, prior to stopping, So let's wait until the legal analysis is completed and whether we see that as a role for financial stability purposes. And let me stress once again, it's for financial stability purposes, not for political, appreciation or calculations. On the other matter, I'm sure that in the course of the questions that will follow, I will be saying a few things in respect of this persistent high inflation that we are seeing now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I give the floor to Pedro Silva Pereira for the S&D.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, President Lagarde, for being with us again in the European Parliament. In October, inflation in the euro area reached 10.6%, but prices declined by 4.2% in Germany, the first month-on-month decrease since May 2020, suggesting that inflation might be approaching its peak, which would be, by the way, consistent with ECB projections saying that inflation will decline in 2023 and even more in 2024. In fact, your Vice President, Mr. de Guindos, very recently said that euro area inflation was likely at this peak or anyway close to it. Now, do you agree with this assessment that we have now more and more indications that inflation, although still very high, might be approaching its peak, and this should have consequences in the decisions of the Governing Council in December? I know that you said that interest rates will remain the fundamental tool of monetary policy, and you expect to raise interest rates even more. But would you say that it is likely that the rhythm of this increase is now reduced, taking into account these indications and also the fact that we are heading to a technical recession in the Eurozone?
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Silva Pereira, for this very focused question on inflation, which I think is well chosen given the importance that it has for people and the very strong value that we give to inflation in delivering on our mandate of price stability. Headline inflation, the one that we look at most, has hit its highest reading in October, 10.6%. Core inflation has been very high as well, at around 5%. And I would like to see inflation having peaked in October, but I'm afraid that I would not go as far as that. I think that there is too much uncertainty, particularly in one component, which is the pass-through of high energy cost at wholesale level into retail level, to assume that inflation has actually reached its peak. It would surprise me. Obviously, in the longer term, inflation will decline, if only because of our monetary policy, number one, but also because bottlenecks that have been putting pressure on supply will gradually fade out. But when you look at the drivers behind inflation at the moment, whether it is food and commodities at large, or whether it is energy, we do not see the components or the direction that would lead me to believe that we have reached peak inflation and that it is going to decline in short order. I think that whenever I ask my top-notch economists at the ECB and I ask about the risks, the answer that I get for the moment is that risk is to the upside without qualifying the upside. So that's how we perceive inflation at the moment, and that prompts us to continue to tame inflation with all the tools that we have. And as you very well noted, the one that is first and foremost efficient in the circumstances is the interest rate. Thank you.
Yes, please follow up.
Yeah, thank you. May I ask a second question, different one, but quite interesting one, on the degree of alignment between monetary policy and fiscal policy. Of course, fiscal policy has to find its way between looking for some consistency with monetary policy, but also supporting the economy, in particular the most vulnerable people and economic sectors, but also not jeopardizing the European funds that are now available for investment for the recovery and the transitions that you mentioned. One of the topics of discussion in the fiscal policy front in the EU currently is the calendar for investments under the recovery plans. Would you agree that a more flexible calendar for the use of the recovery funds will be useful to allow for a better alignment between fiscal policy and monetary policy, and also allowing for better and more rapid results in terms of addressing inflation?
That would warrant a much longer response that I'm allowed to give you, but I will try. Monetary policy and fiscal policy should operate with good understanding of the action of the other. Monetary policy is focused on restoring price stability, on fighting inflation, using the tools that I have just mentioned, and moving out of this accommodative policies that has been the policy for many years, and which is still accommodative, by the way. So that's what we have to do. Fiscal policy, at the same time, needs to be attentive to those that are most affected by the current situation and by the necessary monetary policy action that we take, which is why we say that it should be temporary, targeted and tailored. You must have heard that 1,000 times. Unfortunately, when we look at the budgets and the fiscal plans by the various member states, not all of it is temporary, targeted and tailored. According to the Commission, it's more like 30% of it is. By our own calculations, it's less than 30%, but it is still, anyway, whether it's 30 or 15%, by our own calculations, it is way too little, which means that some of those measures that are taken, which are not temporary, not targeted, not tailored, are actually going to have, ultimately they will contribute to inflation. They will put upward pressure. Certainly when normal operations are restored. They might put inflation under downward pressure in the first phase, but it will return to upward pressure when those measures are removed eventually. I think I would draw a line between the support measures that are decided often at the national level and the fiscal impetus that is given by the Recovery and Resilience Fund, which is targeted at improving the productivity capacity of our European economies, and which, as a result, will improve and increase the output capacity of Europe. So I would not put them exactly in the same basket. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I give the floor to Stéphanie Yancourtin for Renew.
Merci Madame la Présidente. Madame la Présidente, chère Christine, un grand merci tout d'abord d'être ici. Merci pour votre action déterminée afin de protéger le pouvoir d'achat des Européennes et des Européens qui plus que jamais sont attentifs aux décisions prises par notamment la BCE mais également les institutions européennes et les pouvoirs publics. On ne peut qu'accueillir favorablement les signes volontaristes de la BCE de sorte que une nouvelle hausse de taux pourrait être envisagée, mais on est désormais confronté à une inflation persistante à 2 chiffres et sans être devin, peut-être à la différence de mon collègue précédent, on peut penser que l'inflation est là pour rester et persister. Ça pourrait être une réalité de long terme si notamment les marchés ne faisaient pas confiance à la capacité de la BCE à maintenir la stabilité des prix. Avec cette préoccupation en tête, j'aimerais vous poser 3 petites questions. La première, et on l'a bien entendu de votre part, la BCE bien évidemment s'inquiète de voir les taux de la zone euro s'ancrer à plusieurs points au-dessus de la cible. Jusqu'où la BCE est-elle prête à aller pour agir de manière décisive contre ce problème? La deuxième chose est effectivement, comme l'a montré le topic 1 du document qui nous a été distribué, que la BCE vient de sortir, il existe des divergences significatives sur le taux d'inflation entre les États membres et comment l'évolution différente des prix dans la zone euro peut affecter finalement la capacité de la BCE à développer une politique cohérente pour cibler ce problème. Et enfin, j'aimerais vous interroger sur le récent mécanisme anti-fragmentation et sa mise en place bien évidemment vise à alléger la pression sur les écarts de dette souveraine dans notre union monétaire. Comment évaluez-vous son efficacité et la nécessité peut-être de revoir ce mécanisme ou est-ce qu'il est un peu trop tôt puisqu'il était tout à fait récent?
Merci beaucoup, Madame Yon-Courtin. Je vais vous répondre en anglais. I think it's more appropriate for most. So you asked me, in view of the very high inflation rates, as most recently read at 10.6% in October for the whole of the euro area on average. So in view of those high rates, how far will the ECB go in terms of setting interest rates, and how further will you hike interest rates? And I don't have the answer to that question, or rather I have a general answer, which is that the ECB will use interest rates and will hike interest rates as long as much as is needed in order to reach the price stability medium-term target that we have. So we have moved at the fastest pace as ever for the ECB, increasing rates by 200 basis points, first of all moving out of negative territory and then increasing successively by 75 basis points twice. We are not done with inflation and we still have work to do. Whether that will take us into restrictive territory, it may well be. But we will do what is needed and we will use interest rates as much as is needed in order to deliver on that commitment to return inflation to medium-term 2%. On your second question, you are correct. Divergence has never been as important as it is at the moment. If you compare Estonia with France, we have nearly 15 difference in terms of percentage of inflation. And that is largely attributable to the fact that more of the normal basket of consumption of the Estonian consumer, for instance, taking Estonia because this is the highest in the group, the proportion that is spent on energy and food is significantly higher than what is paid in terms of energy and food by other citizens of Europe, namely those who are located in France, because we've taken Estonia and France, although it's not fair to pick and choose 2 countries, but they are the opposite end. So that's one reason. I think the second reason, which is clearly having an impact for those Baltic states that are amongst the most affected, is the proximity of Ukraine and Russia and the horrible war started by Russia against Ukraine, and the fact that in terms of risk, the Baltic countries are regarded as a higher risk. And third, final point is that in some of those countries that have a high inflation rate at the moment, possibly less shield measures have been taken by the governments, at least up until now. Now, we expect those divergences to gradually fade, and we hope that they do fade, but that's the situation that we have at the moment. To the extent that supply bottlenecks associated with the proximity of Russia, notably, to the extent that energy cost will eventually fade out over the course of time as we restructure and change our policy mix, those divergences will narrow. Now, I'm out of my time, but on TPI, suffice to say that transmission protection instrument is there, is available, will be used if necessary, and there is no reason on earth at the moment as to why we should either withdraw it, change it, or amend it in any kind of way.
Thank you very much. Follow up, 1 minute.
Non, parce que j'ai déjà pris beaucoup de mon temps en vous me posant 3 questions, donc c'est bon, je laisse la suite à mes collègues. Merci.
Merci beaucoup. Enrique, Anne, for the Greens.
Yes, thank you very much, dear Madam Chair. Dear President Lagarde, it's a real pleasure to welcome you back to the Econ Committee. The cost of living crisis and challenging outlook for our economies makes our regular dialogue on monetary policy even more important. So we face a particularly complex situation dominated by the energy price shock leading to unprecedented levels of inflation for the euro area. And to confront this challenge, many policy areas must contribute their bit to limit price rises, to reduce demand for fossil fuels, and to reduce inflation without increasing the risk of a recession. And Fabio Panetta recently noted that, and I quote, appropriate public policies that compress the demand for fossil fuels and stimulate the production of cheaper renewable energy sources can help to contain inflationary pressures. And again, we are already using the lower cost of renewable energy to cushion the impact of the fossil fuel shock on energy prices. And this leads me to my question to the ECB. Would you agree that investments in energy efficiency and renewable energies are deflationary in the current context? Thanks.
Thank you, Madam Anne, for your question. As a good person from Normandy, and Mrs. Jon Courtin will understand, I would say peut-être banque oui, peut-être banque non. Because it all depends on timing. I think the jury is still out, and there is a lot of academic research, papers, introspection, speeches being focused on those particular issues. But I think that in general, well, first of all, I would like to start with the fact that it is not green energies that are inflationary at the moment. It is the fossil energies, clearly. But to your specific question of whether or not investment in green energies are inflationary or deflationary, I think I would say it depends over the course of time. And while ultimately once investments are conducted, once the policy, the energy policy mix has changed, then ultimately the marginal unit cost of the green energy, kilowatt, megawatt, whatever you want to measure it in, will be cheaper. But in the first phase, as we will have a transition, which will require probably some continued investment in fossil fuel, whether we like it or not, and significant investment in the production of green energy sources, at least in a first phase, it is likely to have, upward pressure on prices rather than downward pressure on prices. So I think it's really a matter of where in time are you focusing your question. If you say in the medium term, in 5-6 years' time, most likely, but in the first place, probably not.
Follow up?
Thank you very much. I think we might disagree at the latter aspect, but I think we can agree that hiking interest rates is not a very targeted tool, and as this equally impacts all sectors of our economy. And in the current context, price rise come from a very specific source, namely fossil fuels. So would it then not be a more logical and effective use of monetary policy to introduce dual rates or differentiated rates rather than using the blunt tool of rising interest rates across the board? So with its successful targeted longer-term refinancing operations, the ECB has already accumulated a lot of experience when it comes to attaching conditions to the way banks use ECB funds. So this know-how could now be applied to differentiated interest rates for investments in energy efficiency and renewable energies. Do you agree on that? Thanks.
I guess you would agree with me that our mandate is price stability. And as a result of that, the distinction that you draw and that one could find perfectly legitimate would actually result from a decision and a determination that is made here, that is made in national parliaments, that is implemented by governments. And, enhanced credit terms can certainly be decided at those levels, but it is not for the European Central Bank, particularly to the extent that we are now normalizing our balance sheets and procuring to doing that in the months to come. And with the price stability mandate that calls for a unique interest rate, or rather 3 unique interest rates, it's not for the ECB to do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I give the floor to France Jamy for ID.
Oui, Madame Lagarde, bonjour. Je crois que vous serez d'accord avec nous aujourd'hui pour admettre que nous sommes au bord du gouffre, je crois que ça a été dit, puisque la revue de stabilité financière de la BCE de novembre semble le reconnaître elle-même. Alors en effet, l'inflation est là. Et une très grave crise financière s'annonce puisque la BCE nous propose de faciliter le dérapage finalement de l'endettement des États avec le mécanisme anti-fragmentation. Ainsi, tous les États membres pourraient emprunter au même taux, et parce que la crédibilité de l'Union européenne n'existe pas, elle repose simplement sur celle des États membres et particulièrement de l'Allemagne, qui est en grande difficulté aujourd'hui. Ma question est comment pouvez-vous nous garantir que ce ne seront pas les épargnants ou les contribuables qui paieront la note? Enfin, avec la crise économique déjà sévère qui mine le niveau de vie de nos compatriotes, l'instauration de taux variables sur les crédits immobiliers qu'aucune banque française ne pratique va nous mener vraisemblablement à des drames qui toucheront les plus précaires. Alors ma deuxième question, Madame Lagarde, consiste à savoir si on va reproduire l'affaire des subprimes en France et est-ce que la BCE ne va pas ainsi contribuer à tuer le système bancaire français, enfin le modèle bancaire français.
Merci, Madame Jamet, pour vos questions. So on the first one, I would like to disagree respectfully with you because I think that Europe has credibility. And I don't think that we can just assume that the credibility belongs to each and every member state. And we can see that very clearly because we act as the agent of Europe when it comes to the Recovery and Resilience Fund and the borrowing program that the European Commission has been tasked to do. And I can assure you that the Europe as a risk exists on its own. It's a supra-risk, meaning that it is in the same family of risks as the European Investment Bank and a few other international institutions, the ESM as well, and it's obviously another institution that is borrowing at a level which is regarded by rating agencies, by investors, as a risk of its own. So that's point number one. Point number two, I think the action of the European Central Bank, both in terms of its central banking activity, which is often narrowed to the monetary policy determination, but also its supervision activity, which I think will be commented upon on December 1st, because my colleague Andrea Enria will be coming to answer your questions. I think quite to the contrary, has actually helped strengthen the banking system throughout the European Union. You've asked about the solidity of the system and whether the ECB would actually undermine it. I think we have contributed to strengthening the banking system. If you look at the solidity of the banks at the moment, it is significantly stronger than what it was back in 2008. I was finance minister of France at the time, and I can assure you that whether you look at the ratio, the capital ratio, the core equity tier 1 numbers, whether you look at the liquidity ratio, the leverage ratio, there has been significant improvement. And that is caused by your action, but it's also caused by the European Central Bank action, in particular in its supervisory capacity. Thank you.
1 minute follow-up, if you want.
Oui, juste une, sans vouloir être désagréable. Enfin, il y a une amplitude économique dans les pays de l'Europe qui font, Madame Lagarde, qu'on ne peut pas forcément considérer, s'agissant de crédibilité, qu'une addition de faiblesse fait forcément une force. Ensuite, est-ce qu'il n'y a pas une contradiction si on prétend conduire une politique monétaire restrictive avec la hausse des taux d'intérêt pour lutter contre l'inflation, alors qu'on encourage en même temps les États à s'endetter, donc finalement à accroître la masse monétaire qui est parfaitement inflationniste.
Je vous remercie du suivi que vous faites de la question. Je crois l'avoir indiqué dans mes propos introductifs. Ce que nous poursuivons actuellement, c'est notre mandat, la stabilité des prix. Et pour ce faire, nous utilisons un instrument principal qui est le taux d'intérêt. Nous l'avons utilisé rapidement. Nous allons continuer à le faire jusqu'à ce que nous arrivions au taux d'intérêt approprié pour délivrer cette inflation de 2% dans le voilà que je vous parle en français. Pardon. Dans le moyen terme, ça c'est notre objectif. Mais par ailleurs, nous avons aussi indiqué qu'au prochain Conseil de politique monétaire du Conseil des gouverneurs, nous allions déterminer les grands principes de notre réduction de la taille du bilan de la Banque centrale européenne. Donc je pense que quand vous parlez de l'addition des faiblesses ne fait pas une force, je crains malheureusement d'être à nouveau en désaccord avec vous. Merci.
Thank you very much. Johan van Overveld, ECR.
Johan van Overveld.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you also, Madame Lagarde, for being here. The ECB is fighting some very important short-term battles, but there are, of course, longer-term issues which we should address, and I'm thinking here more specifically on about the 2% inflation target. During the last decade, the ECB hardly achieved that target because inflation usually was lower. And as you spoke about yourself in your recent speech at the European Banking Council, there are several forces in the real economy that lead us to expect structurally higher inflation in the future. So isn't it time to start thinking about the usefulness of this 2% inflation target? And due to the fact that you're constantly missing this target, you're undermining the trustfulness, the trust in the ECB. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And you are right to focus on one word which is extremely important, which is that of the credibility of any central bank, including the European Central Bank, and probably more so the European Central Bank, because we are dealing with 19 different fiscal policies and 19 member states, soon to be 20 as of the 1st of January when Croatia returns, or joins rather, the euro area. And that credibility is going to be tested, is being tested by the determination with which we return inflation back to the 2% medium-term objective that we have. And that is the reason why we have to be determined, why we have to take that job very seriously, particularly in view of the high resilient inflation that we are seeing at the moment. Is it time to change the yardstick by which you measure your performance? I don't think so. I think the debate could be had at some stage. The debate was actually taking place a few years back when a very reputable economist who was at the time at the IMF, suggested that another number could be used eventually. But now is not the time to do so. And it's clearly against the objective that has been defined as the price stability that we have to really align our efforts and redouble our efforts going forward. I'm tempted to actually disagree with you on the assertion that you made that we have constantly failed to deliver. I think if you look historically, there was a long period of time when, on average, inflation actually was at 2%. And then we had a period of about 10 years where inflation was way below 2%. To be in negative territory in December of 2020, if you remember. And obviously, we have the situation that we have at the moment, which is too high, persistent inflation that we have to tame. And that's what we will do. Thank you.
Follow-up?
Just for the record, in terms of underachievement, I was referring to the last decade and not to the time before. But anyway, my follow-up question switches to the short term. It's a weak link, I admit, but anyway. You already elaborated on how far should we go with driving interest rates up. Now, Executive Board member Isabel Schnabel last week was quite explicit about that because she suggested that policy rates should end up in real territory, which means above inflation. I'm not going to do the math here, but that means that interest rates would have to go up a lot from where they are today. Do you agree with that statement, or what would in general be your comment on that statement?
You know, the beauty of the European Central Bank, of its Executive Board and its Governing Council, is that while we are all engaged in the same fight, and we all have the same objective ultimately, everybody has their opinion, everybody has their conviction, and I, as President of the ECB, I respect that. And while some people might argue that this is cacophonic, I'm very sorry, but this is a debate. And this is a debate that is healthy and that is good to have. Sometimes difficult to preside over those debates, but it is my job, and I'm very happy to deliver on that job. So it won't surprise you if I say three things. One is we are going to be data dependent. And it so happens that our next projection exercise will be actually in 2 weeks' time. So we are, in a way, relying on numbers and projection and work that has been done back in September, some of which is clearly outdated. But we will have new numbers in December. So that's point number one. We will be data dependent. We will be looking at, obviously, the outlook, but obviously the persistence of the shock, obviously the transmission to the economy, and looking at multiple indicators, some of which have been very, very well dissected by my colleague Philip Lane, who has also given a very good version of his views on certain matters. Both of them, Mrs. Schnabel, Mr. Lane, equally fascinating. Second point is we will be deciding meeting by meeting. So as President, I would absolutely refrain from giving any kind of forward guidance. We have decided that forward guidance was not helpful at the moment. It may well be, and that's going to be a Governing Council decision, that when the time comes to do some quantitative tightening, we give some indications, and that will be part of the principles that we will decide and that we will debate at the Governing Council meeting that is coming up in December. But so, data dependent, meeting by meeting. And third, as I said, which pace, for how long, how high, is not something that I have a view on. The view I have is that it has to be the interest rate that will be sufficiently high in order to deliver the 2% medium-term inflation target that we have. And it, as I said in a previous speech, so I'm not innovating for those of you who are picking up bits and pieces of what I'm saying now, it may well be that it takes us into restrictive territory. But that is something that, as I said, we will be debating meeting by meeting and on the basis of data. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I give the floor to Manon Aubry for the left.
Merci beaucoup. Et bonjour Madame Lagarde. Vous l'avez dit, jusque-là on sera en accord. L'inflation immense que nous connaissons à l'heure actuelle, elle touche davantage les plus pauvres, que ce soit l'impact sur les produits de première nécessité, les dépenses contraintes qui augmentent fortement et entraîne une baisse des salaires réels dans la zone euro, d'où notre responsabilité dans la réponse politique qu'on doit apporter. Et pour ça, il faut une analyse lucide des sources de l'inflation. Et c'est là où j'ai du mal à savoir où vous vous situez, parce que, et ça a été dit à de nombreuses reprises, l'inflation en réalité, en grande partie, elle vient de sources exogènes, que ce soit le choc énergétique notamment. Et vous aviez d'ailleurs dit en octobre dernier, et vous l'avez redit quand même à demi-mot aujourd'hui, que ces derniers mois, la flambée des prix de l'énergie et des produits alimentaires, notamment, ont entraîné une généralisation des pressions sur les prix et une accélération de l'inflation. Ça, c'est la première chose. La deuxième chose, vous avez parlé de la boucle prix-salaire, laquelle boucle est contestée économiquement, y compris par des gens que vous connaissez bien, une étude récente au FMI de ces dernières semaines. Et donc, ma question est double. D'une part, pourquoi continuez-vous à brandir cet argument de la boucle prix-salaire comme justification de votre politique monétaire alors qu'on ne l'a pas vérifié dans la réalité? Deuxième question, la Christine Lagarde d'aujourd'hui, du 28 novembre, je crois, 2022, on est. Est-ce qu'elle est d'accord avec la Christine Lagarde d'octobre 2022, cette citation que je mentionnais, qui expliquait que les causes de l'inflation étaient à trouver dans une perturbation de l'offre liée à une succession de crises majeures et non dans un excès de la demande?
Merci, Madame Aubry, de votre question et vous posez des questions de principe sur lesquelles je vais essayer de revenir en détail. First of all, I continue to say that the largest contributors to inflation at the moment are energy and food. Energy, month over month, is about 41%. Food is about 13%. So those are key components. And as both of you and I agree, it is affecting more the low-income people than the high-income people because they spend more of their consumption basket on energy, on food, on heating, electricity bills, and all the rest of it. I think when you look into the drivers of inflation, and I agree with you that we have to look at drivers to see what is going to be most effective in terms of response. We had for a period of time a major supply shock, and we continue to have a supply shock, the one that you called the exogenous shock. But it's not that simple. It's also fueled by demand. So if you ask me whether the November and the October Christine Lagarde is the same person, the answer is yes. There is a portion of, there is a driver of inflation that is definitely related and caused by supply. But the recovery that we faced after the last of the lockdown period was removed, and the pent-up demand that resulted from that fast recovery, that has increased demand and has brought demand as a driver, not on a par with supply. I think supply is still dominant, but demand is now also a key factor. And if you drill down, you see that non-energy industrial goods in particular, the NEIG as it's often referred to, this one is more influenced by supply factors. If you look at services, it's more influenced and driven in terms of inflation by demand factor. So you have both supply and demand that are moving prices upward. So I think that's on your first key question. The second one, which has to do with the second round effect that we are concerned about, I think it's perfectly fine that some people have different views, but informed by history, we still believe that to have the risk of salaries running on a par or ahead of inflation as it stands now would actually concur to second round risk being embedded in the economy and potential upward pressure on prices that would lead us to have to take a more restrictive policy going forward. So while it is completely legitimate that salaries
I'll speak in Romanian. Bună ziua! Îmi face o deosebită plăcere să primesc din nou la Palatul Cotroceni vizita secretarului general al NATO, domnul Jens Stoltenberg, un prieten apropiat al României. Dear Jens, welcome to Bucharest, here to Cotroceni, and thank you for your great leadership of NATO and for being such a good friend of Romania. Am evaluat astăzi împreună situația de securitate a spațiului euroatlantic generată de agresiunea Rusiei împotriva Ucrainei, cu accent asupra flancului estic și a zonei Mării Negre. Mâine va începe la București cea din